evening.
Yes, Ruskin, I presume that we are on 91.1 FM. Once again, the Emancipation Support Committee of Trinidad and Tobago welcomes its media community to another edition of the Indaba program on Talk City 91.1 FM, on Facebook, and on YouTube. We are live on those media streams. And of course, we have Ruskin Mark with us at Talk City. Greetings, my brother. Hopefully, we would be joined by our co-host, Brother Shabaka Kambon. He might be a little bit late. Renee is in the background, in the back room, I believe it is called, doing the technical stuff for us as usual. And I'm Claudius Fergus. Welcome once again. Remember, you can join the conversation using the numbers at the bottom of the screen there. That number or numbers would continue flashing for the duration of the program. If you wish, you can drop us a voice message as well on WhatsApp, but keep it down to at least 90 seconds. And we will try to play it for you. So we are going to engage you with whatever relevant comments you make, and we are going to give you a little bit of what the program looks like now. The Africa report is back, but we are concerned about the continuing U.S. buildup of its military presence, its huge military arsenal in the Caribbean, but more particularly so as a sort of a blockade around Venezuela that threatens Venezuela's sovereignty. And of course, we will be talking about that again and again, including this evening. As I said, the Africa report is back. I found that there are many African governments at the moment dealing with mass protests, mainly by young people who are questioning the fairness and the outcome of recent elections, mainly in Mozambique, in Tanzania, and in Cameroon. And of course, we don't know how those things are going to turn out. But we are also keeping our eye on South Africa, where a commission of inquiry, I call it an inquiry in the state capture, but it is actually an inquiry into state level, high level corruption within the state architecture. And many anticipate that it would lead to the resignation of President Cyril Ramaphosa. The government, within the past few days, I believe, would have met in a sort of a retreat. They never said what it was, but most people believe it is to discuss the fate of what is called the Government of National Unity. And if that national unity collapses, meaning if some of the parties pull out, that most likely would compel Ramaphosa to send in his resignation. Besides, he seems to know a little bit too, perhaps he may be too close to some of the individuals, let me put it that way. He might be too close to some of the individuals who have been targeted as the main architects of corruption in South Africa. So we expect something to happen there. But in this edition of the Africa report, we focus on Nigeria, which, just like Venezuela, and the most recent, Mexico, is being threatened with military invasion by the United States of America. So you have this sort of a triangle now, which may expand to some other kind of shape. But right now you have 3 countries within a very quick time being threatened with military invasion by the United States. So we will be presenting the Africa report and afterwards some comments on what probably connects the 3 points of this triangle that I told you about. So without further ado, Renee, could you bring up the Africa report? It's a little bit longer than usual, but we'll talk about that after. So Renee, could you bring up the Africa report?
I asked myself a number of questions. Number one,
Nigeria.
In which specific territory does the Americans believe that there is a group of people called Boko Haram, so that if you send your tomahawks there, you eliminate them?
That was Kenyan professor of law, P.L.O. Lumumba, often cited on this program.
Nigerian government cannot openly and deny there is no massacre, there is no genocide of Christians in Nigeria, and look at it today.
And that was Pastor Ezekiel Dachomo, speaking from a mass grave, the immediate trigger that provoked the threat of U.S. intervention. Boko Haram is a Nigerian religious organization and the latest target of American militarism. Nigeria lies directly east of Venezuela, on the other side of the Atlantic. Both countries are currently twinned to the latest jingoistic episode of American foreign policy makers and their imperialist presumptions of impunity in the pursuit of unprecedented global hegemony. It is commonly accepted that in the Venezuelan chapter of this saga, America's true interest is the vast reserves of heavy crude and the wealth of strategic minerals, while the justification for war is narco-trafficking and dictatorship. Similarly, in the Nigerian chapter, America's main interest is the vast reserves of rare earths or strategic minerals, while the justification for war is Islamic genocide against Christians. China's recent ban on export of rare earths to the United States has made it more imperative for America to force itself on Nigeria or other militarily weak countries to acquire these materials. As America's undeclared war against Venezuela heats up, the Africa report looks at the American threat to invade Nigeria. The major difference is that while regime change is the ultimate political objective in Venezuela, with implications for Cuba, the ultimate objective in Nigeria may be much more sinister and may well include partitioning of the country and reversing or neutralizing the Sahelian revolution. I was drawn to the issue by a Nigerian vlogger who goes by the sobriquet Very Dark Man, or VDM. Within hours, Nigerian media were awash with the issue. Trump's guns a-blazing tweet, which VDM reposted, came the day after Trump had described Nigeria as, quote, a country of particular interests, end quote. According to American law, such a designation could only come from the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, who is also piloting the downfall of Nicolas Maduro to close the gate on Cuba. There are really two main issues being debated: the issue of genocide and the issue of national sovereignty, which many commentators conflate into one. The issue of genocide is real. The situation qualifies under United Nations genocide criteria, but it is not restricted to Christians. Listen to how Captain Bish Johnson explains it on the TVC News channel.
Yes, Christians are being killed, Muslims are being killed, but the truth of the matter is, who is doing the killing? Boko Haram is an Islamic terrorist organization that emerged in this country on the premise that they want to establish an Islamic state within the sovereign state of Nigeria, where they will practice Sharia law.
The great tragedy of Nigeria is the little to no control by government over the country's natural resources. Between 2020 and 2024, an average of over 50,000 barrels of crude oil was stolen daily out of a production of just over 1 million barrels per day. the loss in solid minerals in the northern states is much more alarming. It is a virtual free-for-all among mineral thieves with very little revenue returns to the government. Multinational companies invest heavily in maintaining instability in the north, making for easier and cheaper sourcing of solid materials and for easier illegal exports of them. Investigative journalists have discovered that Islamic jihadism expanded in the states in the Middle Belt at the same time that foreigners were raping this region of Nigeria of its mineral wealth. Investigative journalist in exile David Hundeyin acknowledges there is genocide, but genocide against Nigerians, not Christians alone. He also asserts that genocide is concentrated in those areas with an abundance of solid materials for high-tech industries, including the war industry. Perhaps it might be truer to conclude that massacres, forced migration, and genocide are functional to criminal strategies of depopulating vast areas suspected or known to contain deposits of solid minerals. America is known to have keen interest in these materials. But there's also America's contemptuous disregard for Nigerian sovereignty, which is particularly troubling, especially considering that Nigeria has the largest human population in Africa and is the largest black-ruled country in the world. African pride globally is at stake. And yet, the designation of Nigeria as a country of particular interest to America is not one of Trump's hyperboles. The U.S. is currently constructing the world's largest embassy in Lagos, Nigeria's commercial capital, an indication of U.S. strategic and military interest in Nigeria and West Africa. VDM, like many other discerning Nigerians, are fully aware that America's concern is access to and control of Nigeria's wealth, not Nigerian people.
Now, you people need to understand that Nigeria is a country of interest to all the world powers because we have a lot of natural resources with bad leaders.
That was VDM.
So, when people don't understand that, and that this Donald Trump we are talking about doesn't even care about your own black people in his own country. So to think that Donald Trump is going to come here and save you is, I cannot even imagine that you have that many people in Nigeria who cannot think for themselves that the salvation of this country is going to come from within when we are serious.
That was Nigeria's best-known activist, Omoyele Sowore. America's concern about insecurity in Nigeria could well be genuine, but limited to the impact on its own embassy officials, as well as the Americans who might be engaged legally or illegally in mining in the strategic mineral belt in northern Nigeria, which is also the heartland of Islamic Jihad. Threatening Nigeria with war could well be a trump card to pressure the Nigerian government to grant it preferred nation status in exploiting rare earths in the Middle Belt.
We hope to be the economic partner of choice for nations across the continent and all around the world.
America's presumptive role as global police and savior of Christian communities worldwide is supported by a law of the U.S. Congress enacted in 1998 and known as the International Religious Freedom Act. This law was symbolic of American unilateralism in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union. In 2016, the act was amended as the Frank Wolf International Religious Freedom Act, under which the U.S. could assert force to protect the beliefs or conscience of any group, including believers in animism, humanism, Scientology, hedonism, or even atheism. Article 2 of the amended Act states in part, quote, "Because the promotion of international religious freedom protects human rights, advances democracy abroad, and advances United States interests in stability, security, and development globally, the promotion of international religious freedom requires new and evolving policies and diplomatic responses," end quote. Among those responses named were, quote, those coordinated across and carried out by the entire range of federal agencies, unquote. Simply put, these responses include the CIA, sanctions, or military interventions. The United States invokes this religious act to usurp the role of the United Nations Security Council in addressing issues of religious-based massacres and genocides around the world. I interpret this act as Monroe Doctrine 2.0. In other words, an extension of the Monroe Doctrine to the east of the line of Tordesillas dating back to 1494. It is a declaration of American globalism under the guise of religious protectionism, a core object of the evangelical constituency in the American South. Consider the Polish member of parliament who posted a graphic parody of Trump's threatened invasion of Nigeria to the soundbite of the Lord's Prayer, complete with deadly military arsenal and the backdrop of the United States Department of War.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done.
For those on 91.1 FM, what we are seeing are bombs and fighter jets spraying death on Nigerians as the Lord's Prayer is recited. Just as we see in the Caribbean, Nigeria is entangled in its own political contradictions, including the subversion of its sovereignty by the political class. Most analysts agree that the original fundamentalist organization, Boko Haram, was transformed into a terrorist organization with the sponsorship of politicians in opposition to President Goodluck Jonathan, beginning in 2009. Listen to two of Nigeria's most respected civil rights activists, Najatu Bala Mohammed and Femi Falana.
Oh, what started Boko Haram? Everybody knows. It was started in Borno by the then Borno governor, Ali Sharif. He is still roaming the streets freely.
Who started the Boko Haram crisis in Borno State? The governor, Muhammadu Ali Sharif.
He armed them as his political thugs.
The origin of Islamic fundamentalism across northern Nigeria dates to the early 19th century, when Fulani cleric Sheikh Usman Dan Fodio conquered Hausaland and created the Caliphate of Sokoto. The British conquest of Hausaland 100 years later halted the southward expansion of Fulani hegemony, but never killed the Fulani dream of an empire reaching the Atlantic coast. The current problem, however, dates to the collapse of democracy in the mid-1960s, giving rise to the Civil War and the era of military dictatorships down to the end of the century. The era of military reform both evangelical and Islamic fundamentalism. The evangelical elites were satisfied with great wealth and prestige, but the Islamists yearned for a return to pre-colonial values, including Islamic education and the Sharia law. This first stage climaxed in the formation of Boko Haram in 2002. The murder of Boko Haram's leader, Mohammed Yusuf, inside of a police station in 2009 transformed Boko Haram's agenda into unrelenting jihad. When Muslim President Yar Adua died in office during his first term, Christian Vice President Goodluck Jonathan from the South completed Adua's term and was elected for his own 4-year term in 2011. But when Jonathan insisted on running for a second term, the fragile unity between Muslim and Christian Nigeria disintegrated, and the Boko Haram became more virulent. To undermine Jonathan's chances of re-election, several political opponents rallied around the claim that genocide was being inflicted on Christians and that Jonathan was incapable of solving the situation. In 2014, they sent a delegation to Washington to lobby for American intervention and even to arrest President Jonathan. In response, Secretary of State John Kerry visited Nigeria and held secret meetings with political opponents. President Barack Obama also spoke subliminally in favor of regime change.
Now you have a historic opportunity to help write the next chapter of Nigeria's progress by voting in the upcoming elections.
This means that the United States was openly supporting the ousting of Christian Jonathan to be succeeded by Muslim former military dictator Muhammadu Buhari. And Goodluck Jonathan knew about the imperialist web that was being spun around him. Ironically, Nigeria's incumbent president, Bola Ahmed Tinubu, was one of those who insisted that there was genocide in 2014 and demanded American intervention.
Yeah, so there you have it. That's the Africa report for this week. And of course, it all started with that scenario you saw there of the pastor who was in a mass grave appealing to the United States to intervene on behalf of the Christians. But as you heard in the report, that really was not the first time such an appeal had been made. Some of the people in government now, in fact, were the ones who initiated that call for intervention by the United States to quell the genocide in Nigeria. The very same people now in government who are saying that there is no genocide. They're the ones who started that appeal to the United States to intervene on behalf of Christians in Nigeria. But you would see a lot of contradictions, and of course, in the tweet of Donald Trump, where he talks about his cherished Christians, or he might be getting some noises, a passing vehicle. Wow. Okay, that would pass in a short while. That's coming from the road. Yeah, so he talks about his cherished Christians, but there were commentators who would have made reference to the fact that you had cherished Christians in Palestine and in Syria. And what did they get from the Americans but bombs? Bombs that were given to the state of Israel. And of course, Israel is not a Christian country. The head of government is not a Christian either. And yet they're favored over the Christians of the Middle East. And of course, he talks about guns are blazing, coming out guns are blazing, totally disregarding any attempt at diplomacy. So there's no effort, there's no thought whatsoever that the problem could be addressed through diplomacy. And we have to acknowledge that partly the problem lies with Nigeria, as a lot of Nigerian commentators have been pointing out, that since the coming into office of
York City
President
91.1 FM now joins TTT for today's NLCB draw.
Yes, so since May 29, 2023, when this president came into office, he has made not a single appointment of an ambassador anywhere in the world. So there's no Nigerian ambassador in the United States who could have been the intermediary to try to calm things down. There's no ambassador wherever. And that's one of the things they're hustling now to put into place. Right? So a lot could be said here. Of course, I have made a report. There's quite a lot. It's well packed with information and some new ideas. I thought I'm happy to see my co-host appear, because when I mentioned the issue of the doctrine of discovery, I was thinking about you. That here you have in the West, the Monroe Doctrine applies, as you know. The Monroe Doctrine to keep out mainly Europeans from recolonizing or taking economic advantage of the emerging republics and the so-called backyard imperialism of the United States. But east of that line, which was agreed to between the Portuguese and the Spaniards, the Americans seem to have had some kind of respect for that, even by not participating in the scramble for Africa, at least not overtly, chasing colonies. But here we have the United States in the 21st century coming up with this new, well, I call it doctrine because the Monroe Doctrine wasn't really described as Monroe Doctrine as such. It was just coming from Monroe. So I call this, Monroe 2.0, where it seems to be now a doctrine emerging from the far right that in order to legitimize American imperialism in some of these countries, particularly like in Africa, that they would appeal to this religious democracy, the rights of freedom and so on, which is enshrined in one of their legislation. And by so doing, they circumvent the United Nations Security Council, because those are the things that the UN Security Council really address. But they bypass that with this legislation and go directly into action. And of course, by so doing, they seem to erase the line of Tordesillas as such, if I may say so. They have erased the line of Tordesillas. So what you have now is global imperialism legitimized under different principles. So welcome, Brother Shabaka Kambon is here. Welcome, my brother. Nice to see you.
You too as well. Listen, it's a lot.
Check your audio.
Yes. Okay. You should be hearing me now.
Yeah, I'm hearing you now.
Yes. I'm saying that Africa report was a lot to digest and a lot more than I had expected, based on my own preliminary, very, very minor investigation of the issue. And it suggests that this is also a very serious matter, that the United States of America may well be, Donald Trump's utterances may well be a prelude to something serious, military action that's serious. Just let me just clarify for me if that's what you foresee. You foresee this as the dawn or the genesis of something serious, or is it that perhaps it could be but there are no moves in that direction?
Yeah, one of the big concerns that the Americans have is that the Chinese outsmarted them in Africa. So there was a time when they had put, foreign policy towards Africa on the back burner, and the Chinese came in with their Belt and Road Initiative, and that to a great extent gave them easier access to the raw materials of Africa, the minerals of Africa, including access to rare earths and so on, so that they did not directly have to exhaust their own supply, because they have quite a lot. So they were mining a lot of the rare earths in Africa, because the Belt and Road would have given them that kind of advantage. And of course, they were coming with a different ideology, not one of territorial conquest or displacing of governments, overthrowing of governments, and so on. At least we don't see any of that overtly. Whereas with the Western Europe and the United States, it's always a matter of subverting African sovereignty in order to recolonize them to a great extent. So, the Chinese is a factor. That was one of the big factors behind the Libyan, the murder of Muammar Gaddafi by the Obama regime, that the Chinese had entrenched themselves there in the oil industry and mining of other precious metals. Over 30,000 Chinese, I believe, were deeply entrenched in the economy of Libya, and one of the ways of getting rid of them was to destroy Libya. So the Chinese factor is present in a number of these localities where the Americans are trying to muscle back their way in at a time when Africans are looking to push out the French and to minimize the military presence of America. Yes.
So this is the context, and so therefore, this could just be the beginning. These utterances, you believe, are just the tip of the iceberg. There's much more going on here, and perhaps we could expect to see, advances in that kind of imperialism in the 21st century.
Indeed, indeed, because if they can succeed doing that to Nigeria, Nigeria had one of the largest armies in terms of men and equipment, as one of the largest armies in Africa. They had played a key role in restoring stability in Libya and in Senegal, so they have had, battle experience in outside of the country, and quite a lot of those are still generals in the army, so they have that kind of experience there. So if they can do that, just walk in and engage in military action in Nigeria without the permission, because there's nothing about request to partner with Nigeria. It's about guns are blazing. That is what he's saying. Swift action, we move in, we destroy, we move out back. That kind of brazenness does not speak to diplomacy. And if they can do it to Nigeria, I think all African countries should be afraid.
Yeah, let me ask you about
the future.
The Nigerian response that I'm seeing in the media. I'm not sure if I missed this in the Africa report, but it was to the effect that they would welcome assistance with their fight against these Islamic terrorist groups. How has that response gone down in the United States of America? Is there any response from the State Department?
Well, journalists in particular are saying that you don't know, there might be, a back channel type of diplomacy going on, but that is mere speculation. The offer to partner came the first day. Now, the sequence of events should be understood. The first day, Trump simply made a statement about Nigeria being a country of concern. And then the Nigerian presidency sort of hit back. And I think that, when you do that to Trump, he doubles down. And that is where the second statement came from about guns are blazing and so on. So Nigeria would have, in a sense, exercised caution, but of course they would have recognized that they were a sovereign state, and therefore they were not going to fake an American threat just like that. But of course, the bigger threat came after. The first one was a veiled threat, you can say, but the second one was very explicit. That they are going to engage the Department of War, which is the Pentagon, of course. And that means that I don't think nobody thought that Trump would be bluffing at that level. And therefore, it is likely that he would implement that military aggression.
Yeah.
But to answer your question, yes, the government of Nigeria sought to appease the Americans rather than to assert, the right to sovereignty. And as Maduro would have done, or as we see with President Sheinbaum in Mexico, she said, no way, you're not coming here. As soon as the threat to send to send troops into Mexico was made, she said, no way, you're not here, you're not coming here. Right? You're not coming here, and we are not partnering with you in any military engagement to oust the cartels. But I believe Nigeria, which ought to be in a similar position I've said it already that the president of Nigeria might be a compromised person because of his former life in the United States of America and the fact that the CIA describes him as an asset. So he might be a compromised person. Who knows? Who knows? Right? But I see it as a Trumpian strategy. You threaten, and then you find that the threatened parties are seeking to negotiate some kind of resolution. And that usually means that Trump is going to make demands for access to Nigerian resources. They did it in the DR Congo, don't forget. They did it in the DR Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where they agreed to send troops in exchange for access to the rare earth. That is an agreement they would have forced upon the Congolese government. I suspect something similar would be the outcome in Nigeria. I suspect. So before you know it, the Americans are going to have leases for mining in the Northeast and in the Middle Belt states where most of the rare earths are located, at least the deposits, the known deposits. And that is what they're after, because don't forget, with the Chinese banning exports to America, America is getting desperate for rare earths right now. They're getting very desperate, right? Because without access to rare earths, you can't develop, some AI technologies. You just can't. And that desperation could lead them to threaten Nigeria and then negotiate access. I believe that is a possibility.
Yeah, one of the things that you alluded to, or actually stated in the Africa report, is that the Muslim insurgents, the Boko Haram, are involved in a genocide. I thought that was perhaps something that we would have to interrogate. How do you defend such a statement?
What do you mean? What is the evidence for that?
Yeah.
The evidence is overwhelming. They have been building up that Nigeria has a lot of evidence on this thing, The whole thing is about politics. If you don't understand the politics of Nigeria, you wouldn't understand what's going on,
Yeah, there must be a difference between, mass murder, and terrorist violence and genocide. Genocide is a specific, has a specific legal definition. And how do you, who is committing the genocide and who is the genocide against? I mean, in the report itself, you talk about the fact that Nigerians in general are the victims of, of this violence across the board. And as a diverse, Nigeria is made up of a diverse group of populations. So where is the genocide taking place?
Shabaka, most people agree in Nigeria that what you are seeing, that sometimes, of course, they use euphemisms like killings and so on, but they agree. What they disagree on is that it's only Christians that are targeted. I think that's where the line of disagreement is. But that you have over 350,000 internally displaced persons as a result of Boko Haram activities, or let's say jihadist activities, because Boko Haram is just one of many fundamentalist jihadist groups now. It started off with Boko Haram, but you have quite a number of them right now operating in northern Nigeria. And the policy seems to have been, or at least the objective, is to drive certain people out of certain areas where you have these vast deposits of raw materials. That is what is happening, actually. It's on the ground. That is what is happening, right? So it's not necessarily that they're targeting Christians. If Christians are in their way, they're going to attack them. But they also drive Muslims out of certain communities as well, because there are heavy investments in this thing. There are external forces, multinational corporations, and all of that. And people say they see, helicopters coming in, dropping weapons and so on, taking away gold and so on, go back across the border. These things are happening. It is very much linked to the raw materials of the north, right? The solid materials as against oil in the south. It's more difficult to do that kind of thing in the south. But in the north, there is very little control that the government has over those minerals in the north. Most of the minerals are stolen and taken across the border.
Yeah, so this type of thing is not new to imperialism on the continent of Africa. In fact, everywhere that you have resource riches, you have some kind of instability on the continent for the most part, and it takes this form of violence quite often. So my peculiar question has to do with the use of the term genocide in these mass killings, because as you are suggesting now, it's hard to sort of define which people or peoples are being targeted. You're talking about, resource hunters who are claiming territory and displacing people. But genocide, as I said, I'm not sure.
No. It's well known. I didn't name places, but in the states of Taraba, in Benue State, for example, those areas there on the plateau, the communities are well known. They are targeted by mainly the Fulani. The terrorists are mainly of one ethnic group, the Fulani. That is also well known by most people, right? The Fulani.
Right.
You see, northern Nigeria, if you don't understand the history there, you might think it's one people, but actually, the northern Nigeria was dominated by the Hausa people. When the Fulani conquered northern Nigeria, over time, you have this fusion of names, Fulani, Hausa Fulani. You hear people talking about Hausa Fulani. But in modern times, you hear the Fulani saying, the Hausa particularly saying they are not Fulani. Although some families might have intermarried, but they are two distinct people. And the Hausas are also, in a major way, victims of the fundamentalist jihad that is going on as well. A lot of them have been driven out from the native villages. They move out there. Then, after a few months, you have new people moving into the villages, the people who are being protected by the jihadists. It is not genocide. We have to find another name for it, Shabaka.
Okay,
but it's not just mere mass murder and so on. I think that would disguise what is happening in that part of northern Nigeria. Because even the people who deny there's genocide now, those were the ones who started claiming there was genocide, including the president.
So in the case where the violence is such that the word genocide can arguably be used or has been utilized at times, even if we can't, clearly state that that is what is taking place, and you have such a mass displacement of people, and the government cannot manage it and haven't been able to stem this violence, then would it not be a good thing to have external support to protect the lives?
President Jonathan had brought in some mercenaries during his time, and they were quite successful. I'm not saying they should be Americans, but he did bring in some mercenaries because the army is soft on these jihadists. I can tell you that. The policy of the government is to reintegrate the terrorists that are captured back into the society without ever having to face the courts or anything. They call them repentant terrorists and repentant bandits. After spending a few months in camp, they say that they de-radicalize them and reintegrate them into the society. Many of them, it is said that many of them were inducted into the army. Military men say that's not true, but the government had said that is what they were doing under Buhari in particular. So the army itself is compromised. The Nigerian army is compromised, right? And you would hear statements coming from the highest level of Islamic leadership, the Caliph of Sokoto, right? Saying that an attack on Boko Haram is an attack against Allah. This is that kind of sentiment that has kept this movement protected from the state, and getting the state, I mean the Nigerian government, complicit in the whole thing, and so that is why a lot of Nigerians are welcoming the Americans, even if they know the Americans really not too concerned about them as individuals. But if the Americans could stop what is happening, they would welcome America. So right now, Nigeria is split on that because the government has been weak or unwilling to deal effectively with the situation. I follow Nigerian news every day, so I can tell you with certainty what is going on there. I'm tuned into Nigeria every day.
Doc, I've seen a message here for you that we have to remind our viewers of the peace.
You're supposed to give us a report on Matnik,
Yes, I do.
Shabaka, tell us what's going on now. You're supposed to deal with that. I'm glad I was going to say a little bit, as much as I could have, but you're the one that I've been in touch with these two unfortunate girls in Matnik. Brave, but the situation is unfortunate. They're very brave girls. So tell us what's going on and bring us up to date.
Well, I have in front of me here the statement that I'm about to record to be played in the courtroom over the next couple of days, and to send for them. It'll have to be translated, of course, into French. And
okay, Shabaka, before you do that, listen, because we don't know if we would lose 91.1 at the top of the hour. Zakia wanted to remind our listeners of the Sunday evening vigil, and that there's a short video she wants to run. I don't know if Renee has it ready, and then we can cap off the program with the Matnik report, right? If that's okay with you. Renee, if you can bring up the video on the vigil so that our listeners, okay. Okay, so I thought it was a video, but what we're seeing here is a flyer, the call for peace. It's a summon to a vigil or an invitation to everyone. The times there, I can see too well, 5 to 7 on Sunday. That's Sunday coming, Sunday the 9th, I believe it is. And of course, the watchwords are nobody wins a war. Nobody wins a war. You remember that song? Nobody wins a war. Wars are very destructive things. Nobody wins a war. So that is Friday at Woodford Square from 5 to 7. And the Emancipation Support Committee is very much behind this call out. I believe other organizations, other NGOs as well. So see you on Sunday at Woodford Square in order to make a statement, another statement on the Caribbean as a zone of peace. And I think the Americans have been listening, Shabaka. I think they have been listening. They have been listening, and that the popular pushback from around the region wasn't in vain. I think it wasn't in vain. And because if it was in vain, I don't think they would have gone to Mexico. I think the targeting of Mexico is a direct result of the conviction of the people of the region that what is happening in Venezuela and what the Americans plan has no valid justification whatsoever. I think that has been proven. And so they have gone behind Mexico because the argument we have been pushing is the drug trade, the drug route is through Mexico. And the Western and the Eastern Pacific up into West Coast America, not mainly through the Caribbean and not through Venezuela. I think they have been listening. That's my guess. I'm not saying they're not going to interfere with Venezuela still, but I think they have been listening. And that's why they're probably targeting Mexico now. Right, so over to you, Shabaka, and let's hear what's going on in Martinique.
We grant if the voice of the people of the Caribbean is playing a role in deterring the threat of violence that the United States is now menacing Venezuela with. Particularly our voice in terms of making it clear that there's no evidence, and they presented us with none, that the president of Venezuela is indeed some kind of terrorist, narco-terrorist gang leader who is mastermind of some kind of global drug trafficking ring. That there's no evidence for that. The claims that he is a dictator and illegitimate, which go back to which precede him being in office, really, that the leader of the Bolivarian Revolution is not the legitimate leader of Venezuela. Again, no evidence, of any substance for that. And I think that these are the things that really concern Caribbean civil society. All these claims being made, and I mean the most outrageous and outlandish claims being made, to justify the most outrageous and outlandish activity without the evidence. And in fact, we've been able to point to evidence that suggests quite the opposite. So if our voice is in some way, playing a role in changing the course of action, then of the United States of America, then that certainly would be a welcome development. But I have my doubts. So once again, we invite people to come and join us on Sunday. I won't be here. Unfortunately, I would have loved to have said a few words at this vigil, but there will be other activists, and so that can speak to these issues with a great deal of moral and intellectual clarity. And so you can look forward to those things on Sunday. So going back to this event, I mean, today, I think would be the preliminary hearing for these young people that of a trial that will go on for a few days. These are the two young women who, on Emancipation Day, that's May 22nd, 2020, Emancipation Day in Martinique, they claimed responsibility for the toppling of statues of Victor Schœlcher, and then participated in the toppling of monuments in Fort de France 2 months later. That's Pierre Belin de Snambouk, the discoverer or Columbus of Martinique, and Empress Josephine, the Martinican wife of Napoleon, who was from a slave-owning family. And so their trial for these matters starts today and will continue over the next couple of days in Fort de France. So this evening, before I travel, I will record the statement that I have prepared, which will their lawyers assure me will be played in the courtroom at some point in the trial. The crux of my argument is that, and I don't think it would be right for me to read it out, but the crux of the argument is that their own scholars, the Martinican luminaries, Frantz Fanon and Amy Césaire, both addressed these matters. Fanon was very strong in terms of the colonial monuments in general, describing denouncing the entire exercise of a dominant colonizer group erecting monuments to the figures that distinguish themselves in the enterprise of subjugating the colonized group or groups as imperialism condescending to trample on the humanity and dignity and intelligence of the natives. And I make the case that in line with the renowned British historian of Nigerian descent, David Olusoga, that there is indeed a global consensus, particularly strong in the West, in Europe, that certain statues should not be allowed to stand uncritically in public without some sort of contextualization. And David Olusoga, gives the example of Germany and the Hitler statues that he knows are in storage in facilities outside of Berlin. He says it would be insane of us we wouldn't even dream of bringing them and putting them back on public display because they represent something that is morally reprehensible, and that is fascist genocidal violence in Europe. And he says the real problem that we're having today is that we struggle to make the same connection with colonial genocidal violence in the Caribbean. So we understand that fascist genocidal violence in Europe is morally reprehensible, but we cannot stretch our minds to understand that colonial genocidal violence in the Caribbean is equally morally reprehensible. And of course, I point to the fact that if anywhere in the world people should be able to make such a connection, it is in Martinique, because it was their great son, Aimé Césaire, who established that connection, who established that Nazism was the child of colonial violence. And of course, Dr. Fergus, you would know that he wrote that the colonizer, in order to ease his conscience, proclaims the native an animal, gets into the habit of seeing him. If the colonizer gets into the habit of seeing the native as an animal and accustoms himself to treating him like an animal, he thus tends objectively to transform his own self into an animal. And I think this is called the boomerang effect. The scholars have termed his construct the boomerang effect. You commit violence of that nature outside your borders, and they've shown, a number of scholars have written treatises exploring the way historically that violence acted outside of the borders of a state always comes back into the state. And if, of course, we follow that logic, we will imagine that the violence that America and Europe were complicit in Palestine is going to come back home to roost in some form or fashion, if it isn't already doing so. But the point I'm making here is that Césaire saw this connection between the Nazi violence and colonial violence. And so the Martinicans have no right to be so naive about that connection. And they need to see the problem with these tangible forms of epistemic violence that are, planted in their public spaces. I go on to the specific question of shawl share monuments, and I mentioned this before, but the Martinicans, they had a freedom fighter they called Romain, and they believe that their history, their past, the stories handed down from their past tells them that they freed themselves on May 22nd, 1848. And of course, it was May 22nd, 2020 that they attacked the shawl share monuments because as far as they are concerned, the cult of shawl share, which has been developed in Martinique, through statues and an entire town and a library and so on. I think it's a library, a high school, a street, and 2 statues. That cult of shawl share is not an innocent, celebration of a great abolitionist, but in fact designed to get them to forget the role that their ancestors' agency played in their own freedom, and to get them to cleave to France and be grateful to Mother France for this freedom. And so I point out to them that we luminaries, other luminaries like Sir Hilary Beckles, for example, having to deal with these issues in other parts of the region, has advanced the idea that citizens who take who take these matters into their own hands, in keeping with the long-standing and just demands of citizenry, should be seen as conscientious objectors, in much the same way that Rosa Parks was a conscientious objector to unjust segregation laws in the United States of America. And so I advance a case that these young people should be treated, should be celebrated rather than prosecuted.
Shabaka, let me raise some points. I wouldn't want you to expose your defense too much because you never know if the prosecuting lawyer might be listening to you before you give your testimony. So, but I anticipate some issues with respect to the citing of Césaire and Fanon side by side, because as you know, Fanon had his issues with the French establishment in a way that Césaire didn't. Césaire was more part of the establishment. Fanon had gone against the establishment. So while their works stand out as classic for decolonization and so on, we are talking to the French establishment here. And I'm wondering how they may react to that, particularly if you look at French colonial policy was one of what is called assimilation. What the 2 young women did was to go completely against the grain of French assimilation. They challenged it in a way even more radically than Césaire would have done, because negritude, which was a movement that contested French assimilation to some extent, did not really repudiate French values and so on. So Césaire was treading both in terms of being proud to be an assimilate, an assimilation, an assimilé, I think they call it, an assimilated person, while wanting to embrace his Africanity at the same time. I think that was the challenge with the negritude movement, that they did not want a complete break, and that's why Nkrumah would have called them sentimentalists, and he wanted to have nothing to do with them, right? So in that context, and saying that Césaire perhaps himself might have indicted these girls for destroying the statue.
My research actually
As
says
mayor of Fort-de-France, he might have even indicted these girls. Now,
Well,
I'm not condemning Césaire in any way. I'm talking about establishment, how the establishment might respond to
yes, well,
what
I've
they did.
gone deep
So in that context, I'm putting a challenge to you, in other words, that something if you send the testimony, you may not be cross-examined, but if you are there, you'll be cross-examined, of course. So
yeah, but what
that is the kind of issue I believe you have to be prepared. You have to be prepared to contend with.
yeah, so I did a deep dive into Césaire's work. And what I discovered is that, and in fact, Césaire is called by many scholars a Schulcherist, right? He was he had a deep admiration.
I'm glad you agree with me, huh? Yeah, I'm glad you agree with me.
Even Césaire, who embraced the designation of a Schulcherist, pointed out that the Schulcher statues, they were used by the state. He was clear that they were used by the state to create alienation, to alienate people from their own history. So even Schulcher expressed, I've been able to find in my research that he expressed concerns about the use of the Schulcher monuments in Martinique. So I think that
but remember, it's not just the removal of this monuments, it's the destruction, utter destruction, breaking into pieces. So it is that might be an affront to some people, that they did not just move the statue, but they mashed it up in a way it can't even be repaired.
Yeah, I think it was difficult for not just for the Martinican and the French public, but even for Caribbean thinkers as well, to understand how a movement that was anti-racist, a movement that sought to address structural racism and white supremacy, would turn its attention to a monument dedicated to an abolitionist, a man who would have sacrificed, some of his time and energy and life's work to advance the cause of freedom. And so that's why I dedicate half of my presentation to explaining how statues are used in general. Statues are erected by individuals or the state or civic groups with power and capacity to advance their own values and interests, right? I established that is in fact the case, and that these monuments are in fact carefully designed strategies to not just to remember a certain aspect of the past, but to get people to forget other aspects of the past. And of course, what has been done and what makes the Martinican situation that much more worse is the fact that the people of Martinique have been seeking amicable discourse with the authorities now for decades on this monumental landscape, much like other people across the Caribbean. But they have gotten absolutely no response from the authorities in Martinique, leaving them or forcing them to take action, to take things into their own hands. And of course, if we're honest about it, the authorities have to take some responsibility for that. These matters should have been addressed a long time ago, and perhaps if they had been, then maybe some of the share monuments could be saved. I mean, there was one that really kind of, in its semiotics, in its form, tells a condescending narrative, beyond the general narrative that they all tell, which is again to obscure, minimize the agency of Africans in their own freedom, the African Martinicans and Guadeloupeans and so on, in their own freedom. But there's one that really kind of tells an even more condescending narrative, of these kind of children being granted freedom rather than working and achieving such, which was the case in that country. So, but these things would have been addressed, and they haven't been. And when they don't, when authorities refuse to address the case, as in the case of our own country here, if the authorities continue to maintain these Columbus monuments, despite all the objections of people, at some point, the people would have taken it into their own hands to remove the Columbus monument. There's no two ways about that. And so that's exactly what happened in Martinique.
Okay, in building your case, Shabaka, I'm wondering if you might want to take into consideration the change or apparent change in attitude of President Macron, which was articulated earlier this year on the bicentenary of the ransom that was imposed on Haiti, where he promised, I don't know if it is done already, to set up a commission, a joint commission, comprising of French, many historians, and the historians in the overseas territories, and to interrogate the narratives of colonialism which have been perpetuated. Many in Haiti was talking about, but I see it as one history, right? The French colonial history is one history. And when those statues were destroyed, his reaction was that the Republic will not tolerate the erasure of its history. But in 2025, I'm not saying he changed its tune, but it seems as if his public utterances contradict that kind of imperialist stance that he took in 2020. I don't know if you might incorporate that change in policy. I don't think his mentality changed, but he did make the statement, and it was accepted by some representatives from Haiti as the way forward to resolving the historical relationship between France and the colonies.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't have the time to go now to investigate that and to make that connection. But what I did do was to put the President Macron's statements about Martinique into some context. I pointed out that during the heyday of modernization between the Second World War and let's say about the mid-80s, there was the critical view of Fanon about monuments was paramount. Nobody, for example, questioned when India, for example, took down the monuments to King George V and Queen Victoria and all the host of viceroys and ladies and gentlemen and military generals in the 1950s. Nobody questioned that at that time because, in that period, everyone across the world, including the colonizers themselves, saw these monuments as something anachronistic and perhaps even embarrassing. They understood that the natural response of the colonized people at independence would be a rejection of these celebrations of the figures that distinguished themselves in colonial violence. It is only in the 80s somewhere, as a consequence to a large extent of what one scholar describes as the authorized heritage discourse, which promoted the idea of heritage through the existing material in the built environment, that people began to embrace these controversial monuments in a different way. And so I put Macron's statements in 2020. I think it was June 2020. He spoke in between the fall of the Charles monuments and the fall of the other monuments in Fort-de-France. I put them in that context. And once I think, and I argue that once people begin to look squarely at the reality, they can change their minds. They can transcend that
Yeah, but of course we have two dimensions there. One is politics, and the other one is judicial, and the courts are dealing with the law. And the thing is to convince them that despite what the law says, we are living at different times now where that law cannot be applied. So that is a big challenge for them. But let me ask you this question, just to bring clarity to the listeners. The incident took place in 2020, I believe, in the week of George Floyd incident. Why did it take so long? I thought the court system there would have been much faster, would have moved much faster. What's the reason for the delay? And secondly, if you can clarify for the listeners, there are different statues in different islands, in the Guadeloupe and Martinique in particular. And while you mentioned Shulsher repeatedly, there was Josephine as well. I think they attacked and destroyed Josephine as well. Which statues were they charged with? Which ones? And which ones were they not charged with? And where? Is it all of them in the two islands? Could you clarify that for us?
Yes, my understanding, well, they're not charged with anything in Guadeloupe, but my understanding is that they're charged with all the monuments that fell in Martinique. They claimed responsibility immediately after the fall of the Shulsher monuments for them, and highlighted and encouraged people to take a critical stance on the monuments in Fort-de-France, which included Josephine and Destambouk, which fell 2 months later. And of course, they participated in those, in toppling of those monuments there as well. Just to note that the grand monument to Josephine, I went to see it myself before it was toppled. Absolutely grand. I haven't seen any monument on that scale anywhere else in the Caribbean. It has always been headless. The Martinican people have never allowed Josephine to have a head ever since she was erected. Every time the French authorities replace a head, they quickly remove it. And so, the likelihood, if you had passed through Fort-de-France and seen this monument, is that it would have been headless. And so they've always protested these monuments, and they can point to that as part of that protest. But they've never been able to get the authorities to sit with them and to discuss why these monuments are an insult to them. And of course, even the great Martinican luminary Frantz Fanon said that that was in fact the case. And even Schulcher, even Césaire, who was himself a Schulcherist, saw the use, the way that monuments were being used in Martinique as through a critical lens.
Yeah, but why so long compared to the case in the Bahamas that went through the system much more speedily, the Smith case? Why only now? Do you have any explanation for that? Why so long after? And might that be in their favor that it took so long to bring the case before the court?
I don't think it is in their favor. I think it's a deliberate strategy. I mean, this is my thinking. I don't have any evidence to this effect, but I've thought about it. Even when months after the event and nothing had really happened in the courts and so on, I wondered. And my thinking was that perhaps the idea is to wait until things die down to address the issue when nobody's eyes are on these young women. And so we have to make sure now that we can get the attention of the region back on these young ladies so that we could prevent a miscarriage of justice.
Okay, great. I think we are at the top of the third half hour of the program, and we are happy that 91.1 is still with us. But here's where we need to say good night, good evening, good night to everyone, and thanks for taking in the program this evening. And of course, don't forget the vigil on Sunday at Woodford Square. So this is a time to say thanks to 91.1, our listeners and viewers on Facebook and YouTube. And wherever you're heading, my brother, have a safe trip.
Thank you, Doctor, and thanks again for that fascinating Africa report. And we look forward to updates in the next couple of weeks.
Okay, so good night, everyone. See you again next week, same time.